even back it up when you miss something Nathan Dean said, which is pretty cool. Glad you're with us here. This is why we lobby. The headline broke yesterday. Katanga Johnson in our newsroom here at Bloomberg got his hands on a 3-page document. The Federal Reserve is showing it off to other regulators right now. Think Basel III, the bank capital overhaul plan. Looks like it just got watered down a lot from the documents that we're seeing, but nothing is approved yet. And it follows a massive lobbying effort from the big banks to keep this from hurting or even happening. Nathan Dean's been following it for us, and we talked to him frequently about it. We actually got a break on this one from Bloomberg Intelligence. He is senior U.S. policy analyst. I bet your phone's been ringing the last 24 hours. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, we're getting a lot of client calls.
Is the call relief? Nathan, you called it this, or is it concern that this something actually might go through here because this could still morph?
Yeah, so what the clients are looking for is certainty. So the way this works is that the Fed proposed this. We saw a 5 to 19% capital increase under the proposal, 5 for the regional banks, 19% for those Bank of America large investment banks. Now, what Katanga Johnson broke was this idea that they're going to pull it back, that overall capital amount. Now, we don't know, but a lot of people are thinking 7 to 10%, 5%. So that's a dramatic decrease for those large investment banks. Obviously, that's good news. But the problem here is, are they going to finalize it this year like they've said they're going to, or are they going to have to repropose it? There's just still a lot of questions on can this get over the line and a lot of different scenarios. So essentially what with our clients is we have to play scenario analysis.
Okay.
If it's finalized this year, this is how much capital the banks are going to need. If it's reproposed, then obviously it depends if Biden or Trump wins.
I see.
And then go from there.
Well, how much time would they have to sock away all this cash?
So under the proposal right now, compliance would begin July 1st, 2025, and then it's a 3-year phase-in. A little bit more relief for the regional banks. They can actually take a little bit more time. But the question here is, if it's finalized in November, Europe has already delayed implementation of their version. They call it Basel IV, but it's actually the Basel III endgame.
Okay.
Europe has delayed it by 1 year.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Fed were to do something similar. So that July 1st deadline, it's still there right now, but if the finalization comes later this year, don't be surprised if they push that off to maybe January 1st, 2026.
Okay. Wow. So we need Basel IV t-shirts now? I didn't even get the Basel III t-shirts.
Only if you're in Europe. That's why they call it the end game here.
Yeah, but we got to have this covered at some point. Okay, you're a former banker.
Yep.
You're going to start saving that money regardless the uncertainty. Knowing well, Donald Trump could show up and undo all of this if he's elected, right?
Yeah, so that's the problem that I think a lot of people, especially the banks up in New York, are having at the moment is what do we do? Now, bank method is you always take the most conservative route. So if there's an inkling that this rule is going to stay, the banks are going to prepare for it and they're going to start collecting that capital.
Right.
But then the question is, there's 2 questions. One, if President Trump wins, what happens? Well, if they finalize it beforehand and it's not overturned by the CRA or anything like that, the banks are going to prepare for it and they're just going to have to wait and see over the next few years if the President Trump administration begins to pull that back. Because remember, Jerome Powell and Michael Barr at the Fed, they're there until 2025 and 2026. But the other question comes from the courts. Now, if somebody goes down to Texas and sues in the Fifth Circuit and the courts say, we don't like this, it's pulled off, the banks are still going to keep that capital. They're not going to start ignoring the rule until that plays out through the Supreme Court, and then that's years.
Wow.
So either way, anticipate these banks to start preparing for this.
Act like it's real.
Just because, and look, it's like a submarine. You can't turn on a dime. The banks have to have time to start collecting this capital.
Yes, right. Crazy Ivan. That's interesting, though, because it's not Congressional Review Act we're talking about, right? Trump could do anything he wants with this on day one if he's back in the White House.
Sort of. So there's 3 regulators to this. It's the Fed, the FDIC, and the OCC.
Don't they report to him? Well, kind of.
The Fed
Not
doesn't.
The Fed so much,
the Fed's independent. And, unless Jerome Powell or Michael Barr
The Fed can't do it without those other regulators, though, right?
But
Who
that's
do
it.
report to them.
So the OCC is the one, because it's a Department of Treasury, the OCC would flip almost immediately. So now you get regulatory arbitrage. And if you get this idea that the OCC goes out to the banks and says, we don't want you complying with this rule, but the Fed says we want you complying with this rule. That hasn't really happened in the last 20 or 30 years. So ultimately, I think what will happen is that you'd either get it really depends on the leadership of the OCC, but I think you would get a scenario where maybe somebody's going to sue, and I think they're going to defer to the courts on that case.
Amazing. Well, this is going to be fun. We're talking about this the rest of our lives, basically, it sounds like. I'm guessing this does not come up at the debate on Thursday.
Probably not. I would
Also
love to.
free.
I would love it if it
Wouldn't
did.
you? Yes,
but,
you would.
But probably not.
A lot of things are going to come up. I don't know. This could be a silly exercise. Nobody seems to know, but the moderators are going to try to get to some policy.
Yeah.
How should investors be watching this?
So look, I'm just going to presume policy comes up and none of the name calling or anything like that,
Yeah, fine.
so forth. But
Play
policy comes up. There's two things to think about. First is headline risk. Will either president say something that we haven't heard before?
Okay.
President Trump has said 60% tariffs on China. If he makes a statement like that, and we aren't aware of it, there's going to be a
Could
headline
move
risk.
markets, yeah.
Exactly. But then that comes to the second point. Every policy statement that comes out of either President Biden or President Trump's mouth, make sure you put on your hat that says, what will Washington do? There are three ways to getting things largely through: executive orders, regulations, or legislation. Legislation, look, you don't have to be a Washington expert to know things don't really pass much all that here.
Yeah.
Regulation, it takes time, and executive orders are geared usually towards the executive branch and are usually directing his or staff to do either regulation or legislation.
Okay.
So just keep in mind that a lot of what comes out of their mouths and policy relies on to either Congress or the regulators,
Sure enough.
which means the odds of it happening are small, or we're going to have a lot of time before the regulatory framework to kick in.
You think about some of the stocks, as you put it, though, that have hot sauce, particularly in reaction to headlines, that we talk about: solar stocks, cannabis stocks. These are the kind of things that could move on an offhand remark from either the president or the former president.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just the question of uncertainty.
Yeah.
We don't know what will happen, because even though if we could get policy statements, you still don't know what's actually going to be implemented. Because look, let's just say, pick on tax, for example.
Yeah.
If President Trump were to come out and say, here are all the tax changes I want, somebody who's over at Congress sitting there saying, look, it's three equal branches of government. And the House and Ways and Means Committee would certainly say, thank you, President Trump, for your opinions, but we're going to have some ideas of our own here. So, the president obviously sets the marker and says, this is what I want to see happen. But when it comes to scenario analysis and trying to figure out what happens going forward, you got to play with all the different scenarios, create a very broad idea of what you think is going to happen. And as you get closer and closer to the actual catalyst event, in this case, let's say tax reform, the ideas will actually merge and you'll get something a little bit more specific you can play with.
Really interesting. When you consider broader headline risk, whether we're talking about the Middle East or Ukraine, potential to move commodities, oil, even metals in some cases, if we're talking about China or Ukraine and access to rare earths, you could see defense stocks move. This actually brings a fairly broad potential for market impact.
Yeah, so everything that I just said, ignore that for geopolitical. The reason being is that the power of the presidency is a lot more powerful when it comes to tariffs and national security.
You don't need Congress for that.
Exactly. And so when it comes to these, when you hear him talk about Ukraine or China or Taiwan or so forth like that, that's where things get a little bit murkier, at least from a policy standpoint. And that's where you have to go away from Capitol Hill and go up the executive, go up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House and try and actually understand what is the president going to do here. And then again, you have to play out that scenario analysis. And our friends over at Bloomberg Economics do this almost every day.
Yeah, they're so great at what they do as well. Are you getting phone calls about this debate, or that's a Friday story for you?
I think a lot of the investors, I think Argentina's playing that night. So I think a lot of the folks up in New York are...
well, maybe the market's not even watching. I don't know. Am I overplaying that?
No, and it's something you got to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if you're not going to commit all 90 minutes to it, certainly it's something you should read on Bloomberg News the next day.
You can watch it live here, Bloomberg TV. You don't have to call it the CNN debate. That's what I was... Like, they own this thing.
Yep.
There's no more commission.
But,
It's commercials. It's a brave new world, Nathan Dean.
no audiences, the mics are going to get cut off.
What do you think about that?
Honestly,
Let's
I think...
take you right off the path now.
But, I think obviously that we've seen over some of the earlier debates that the audience members try to get involved. I mean, it's
Sure,
a new
that's true.
world. Everybody's trying to score political points. And so I think if this format, fingers crossed, you could actually potentially get some policy or disagreement or discussion here. And that's really what I'm hoping for.
Is this a quiet season for you? Things are quiet on Capitol Hill now.
Yeah, I mean,
Not a lot happening.
we're waiting for the regulators to do a lot of stuff. Like the SEC has a lot of rules on equity market structure.
Yeah.
We thought were going to come out in April. They still haven't come out yet. We're waiting for the Basel III endgame because the regulators love to get their stuff out before they go off to the Outer Banks.
Right.
And so come that
Well,
late July timeframe,
okay.
I'm expecting them to be busy.
So that's when you go off on your summer.
Yeah,
I got
exactly.
you. Great to see you, as always.
Thanks for having me.